Built this place 3 years before the world ended, back when people thought I was paranoid. Back when prepper was still something folks said with a smirk. The cabin sits on a cliff face in the Bitterroot Range, accessible only by a route I carved myself. Part trail, part climbing path, part deliberate misdirection. No roads lead here. No property records exist for this land. I made sure of that. My name is Dalton Vess, and I'm telling you this because if you're hearing this recording, I'm probably dead, or maybe I finally made it out. Either way, someone should know what happened up here. The last normal day was a Tuesday in October. I remember because I'd just gotten back from Missoula with supplies, my quarterly run to stock up before winter hit. Drove my truck to the usual spot, a box canyon 12 miles from here, hidden behind what looks like impassable boulder field. Hiked the supplies in over 2 days, making 3 trips. The truck stayed there, covered in camo netting and branches. By the time I finished hauling everything up, my shoulders ached like someone had beaten them with rebar. That evening, I noticed something wrong with the radio. Static where there should have been the normal programming. I cycled through AM stations, then FM, finding only fragments of broadcast. Emergency tones, someone screaming, then nothing but white noise. The satellite internet I'd rigged up, a small dish hidden in a rock outcropping, still worked. That's how I saw it unfold. Portland went first, or at least that's where the first confirmed reports came from. Some kind of infection, they said. Rabies-like, they said. Contained, they promised. Lies, all of it. Within 48 hours, Seattle was burning. Then, Spokane. The infection spread faster than anything medical science could explain. Bite transmission, yes, but also through scratches, fluid contact, maybe even aerosol in enclosed spaces. Nobody could agree, and by the time they might have figured it out, there was no they left to do the figuring. I watched cities collapse through webcams and news feeds, watched the military try to establish quarantine zones, watched those zones fail, every single one. The infected, I won't call them zombies, that word feels too Hollywood, too neat, moved with this terrible purpose, not slow and shambling like in the movies. Fast when they wanted to be, coordinated in ways that shouldn't have been possible for creatures without higher brain function. But that's wrong too. They had something like intelligence, pack hunting intelligence, trap setting intelligence. The internet lasted 6 days, went down in sections as power grids failed, as infrastructure crumbled. I'd already stopped watching by then, already accepted that the world I'd prepared to escape from had actually ended. The cabin sits at 8,200 feet, built into a cliff face that overhangs a gorge, 300-foot drop to jagged rocks in a creek below. Behind the cabin, solid granite rises another 600 feet, too sheer to climb without technical gear. The only approach is from the north, along a trail that doesn't look like a trail unless you know what to look for. I built it myself over 2 summers, every board hauled in by hand, every nail driven with my own hammer. The main room is 16 by 20, with walls of chinked logs I cut from deadfall and standing dead trees. A sleeping loft runs along one side, accessible by a ladder I can pull up if needed. The roof is sod and stone, invisible from above, looking like just another part of the mountainside. The windows are narrow and high, more like gun slits than actual windows. Shutters on the inside, heavy oak reinforced with steel plates I packed in piece by piece. A stone fireplace vents through a chimney that runs up through a crack in the cliff face, dispersing smoke so it doesn't create a visible column. Water comes from a spring 50 yards from the cabin in a cave I've fortified with a steel gate. The spring feeds a cistern inside the cabin, 200 gallons of storage that gravity feeds to a small sink. Overflow runs out through the cliff face, creating a small waterfall that's been there long enough that anyone seeing it would think it natural. Solar panels on a southern-facing ledge hidden behind rocks charge a battery bank in the cabin's crawl space. Enough power for LED lights, the satellite system when it worked, and a small refrigerator I'd installed more from habit than necessity. Up here, The cold does most refrigeration work from October through May. Food was always the main concern. 3 years of stockpiling had left me with a substantial cache: rice, beans, flour, salt, sugar, canned goods, freeze-dried meals, protein powder, vitamin supplements. Enough for 2 years if I was careful, 5 years if I was desperate. I'd also put in a root cellar dug into the cliff face behind the cabin, where I stored potatoes, onions, carrots, and other vegetables I'd grown in a small garden plot during the summers. The garden was my pride. 20 by 30 feet of soil I'd hauled up in buckets over months, mixing it with composted material and what little topsoil existed up here. Surrounded by a fence to keep out deer and elk, with netting overhead for birds. Short growing season at this altitude, but I'd selected cold, hardy varieties. Had managed decent yields of root vegetables, some lettuce in early summer, peas, kale. That first week after the world ended, I didn't leave the cabin except to check the spring. Spent my days listening to the hand crank radio, hoping for something, anything, that suggested organization, resistance, safe zones. Got nothing but screams and static. By day 8, even that stopped. The silence was worse than the noise had been. I kept busy. Inventoried supplies 3 times, making lists on paper since the laptop's battery would eventually die and I needed to conserve power. Checked every seal on the cabin, every shutter, every hinge. Cleaned my weapons, a Remington 700 hunting rifle, a Mossberg 500 shotgun, a Glock 19, and a .22 rifle for small game. Ammunition was plentiful. I'd been buying a box or two every month for years, and it had accumulated into a substantial stockpile. Night was when the fear came. The cabin was solid, the location nearly perfect, but lying in the loft in the darkness, I'd imagined scenarios. What if they could climb? What if the smell of cooking drew them from miles away? What if someone who knew about this place, one of the old-timers from town who might have seen me on the trails years ago, what if they came here infected? Sleep came in fragments. 2 weeks in, I decided I needed to scout. Needed to know if the infection had reached this far into the mountains. Needed to see with my own eyes what I was dealing with. I left before dawn, carrying the Glock and a knife, moving along the cliff paths I'd memorized during construction. The terrain up here is brutal. Loose scree, sudden drop-offs, false trails that end in vertical faces. I'd learned every inch of it, knew which rocks were stable, where the handholds were, which routes offered escape options. The old logging road was 6 miles away, down in the valley. I reached it by mid-morning, moving slow and careful. Found tire tracks, fresh ones maybe 2 or 3 days old. Boot prints, too, running alongside the road, running from something. Then I found the car, a Subaru Outback. Doors open, windows smashed, blood on the driver's seat, no bodies. Supplies scattered in the road, clothes, camping gear, a child's stuffed animal lying in the dirt. I approached with the Glock raised, checking angles, listening. The forest was too quiet. That's what I noticed first. No birds, no squirrels chattering, just wind in the pines and my own breathing. I found the first body 30 yards into the trees. A man, maybe 40, wearing hiking boots and a fleece jacket. His throat was torn open, the wound clearly made by human teeth. The flesh around the bite was discolored, blackish purple spreading from the edges. His eyes were open, clouded white. I put a bullet in his head anyway. I'd seen enough footage to know that the infection didn't always show immediate reanimation. Sometimes they lay dormant for hours before rising. The suppressor on the Glock kept the shot relatively quiet, but not silent. Sound carries strange in mountains. I waited 5 minutes, listening, watching. Nothing moved. Found 3 more bodies within a quarter mile. A woman, 2 teenagers, boy and girl, siblings from the resemblance. Same bite patterns, same discoloration. I didn't waste bullets on them. They'd been dead longer, the smell told me that, and the mountain scavengers had already started their work. but it meant the infected were here, had been here recently enough to kill these people. I made it back to the cabin by late afternoon, moving faster than was safe, checking behind me every few minutes. Saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched never left. That night I kept the shutters closed and didn't light a fire, eating cold food from a can and sitting in the darkness with the Glock on my lap. The next 3 weeks passed in a routine that felt both comfortable and suffocating. Morning. Check the perimeter. Make sure no tracks approach the cabin. Tend the garden, though it was late in the season and most plants had finished producing. Midday. Maintenance tasks, cooking, reading. I had books, dozens of them, hauled up during the construction phase. Evening. More perimeter checks. Prepare for night. Secure everything. I saw my first infected from the cabin on day 23. Movement caught my eye around noon. Something scrambling along the ridge to the east, about half a mile away. Through the binoculars I kept by the window, I could make out a human figure, moving erratic and wrong. It would sprint, then stop suddenly, head cocking like it was listening. Then sprint again in a different direction. It never came close to the cabin. Might not have even known I was here. But watching it move, seeing the unnatural speed and the strange pauses, confirming that these things were real and not just images on a screen, that changed something in my head, made it concrete. They were here, in my mountains, in my sanctuary. I started going out less. The scouting trips were stopped. I had enough information. The infection was widespread. Survivors were few or non-existent in this area, and the infected roamed in patterns I didn't yet understand. Food became the priority. Winter was coming, and while I had stockpiled supplies, I'd always planned to supplement with hunting and fishing. The creek in the gorge below held trout, and I had fishing line and hooks. Deer and elk moved through these mountains in numbers, and I'd counted on harvesting 1 or 2 each fall. But hunting meant exposure, meant noise and blood and smells that might draw attention. I struggled with the decision for days, watching my fresh food supplies dwindle, knowing the preserved stuff would last longer if I could add meat to the diet. Eventually, hunger made the choice. Not starvation, I wasn't there yet, but the body's insistence that it needed more than rice and canned vegetables. I chose a spot 2 miles from the cabin, a meadow where I'd seen elk before, set up before dawn, downwind with the rifle and 3 rounds loaded. Told myself I'd take 1 shot. If I missed, that was it. Come back another day. An elk appeared just after sunrise. A cow, no calf with her. Clean shot at 100 yards. I took it, and she dropped immediately. The sound echoed through the valley, impossibly loud, and I immediately knew I'd made a mistake. But the elk was down, and wasting it would be worse than the risk. I field dressed her as fast as I've ever worked, hands shaking, blood up to my elbows. Took the back straps, tenderloins, and as much meat as I could carry. Left the rest, hating the waste but unable to risk multiple trips. Made it back to the cabin in under an hour, moving fast, the pack heavy enough to make my legs burn. Spent the afternoon cutting the meat into strips, starting a smoking process, using the fireplace and green wood that would take days. The smell was incredible and terrifying. Smoke meant visibility. Meat smell meant attraction. I kept watch all night, the rifle across my knees, seeing shapes in every shadow. Nothing came. Over the next week, I finished smoking the meat, storing it in cloth bags hung from the ceiling beams. Probably 60 pounds total, enough protein to supplement my diet for months if I was careful. The hunting had been successful, but I didn't plan to try again soon. The risk versus reward was too narrow. The first snow came in early November, a light dusting that melted by afternoon. I watched it from the window with mixed feelings. Snow would make tracking easier, show me if anything approached the cabin. But it also meant winter isolation, months when leaving would be difficult or impossible, when the cold would be as much an enemy as the infected. I'd planned for this, though. Had a full cord of firewood stacked under a tarp, plus deadfall I could gather from nearby. The cabin's insulation was good, the fireplace efficient. I'd spent winters up here during construction, and knew what to expect. What I hadn't planned for was the loneliness. 3 years of preparing this place, I'd imagined it as a refuge, safety, independence from a world I found increasingly hostile and chaotic. And it was all those things. But I'd never spent more than a month up here at a stretch, always knowing I could leave, go back to town, see people, hear voices besides my own. Now the silence was permanent. No internet, no phone service. Never had that up here anyway. No radio broadcasts, just wind and creaking trees, and my own thoughts echoing in the confined space. I started talking to myself. Not crazy talk, I told myself, just thinking out loud, narrating my actions. Okay, Dalton, let's check the water level. Good. Still at 3/4. Should boil some for drinking, purify a batch for cooking. Hearing a voice, even my own, helped. I also started keeping a journal. Had never been much for writing, but with the laptop dead and time stretching endlessly, putting thoughts on paper seemed important. Recording what happened, what I observed, how I felt. Maybe somebody would find it someday. Maybe I'd read it years later and remember this time differently than I experienced it. Entry from November 12th, a month after everything ended. Heavy snow last night, 8 inches. No tracks around the cabin this morning, which is good. The isolation is getting to me. I catch myself having conversations with people who aren't here. Yesterday, I argued with my brother Gannon about whether I should have invited him up here before things collapsed. He died in the initial outbreak, saw the report online. Phoenix overrun in the first wave. But I still talk to him, explain my choices, defend them to his ghost. The food situation is stable. Smoked elk is holding well, rationing the canned goods. The cold means I can store fresh snow for water, saving trips to the spring. Firewood consumption is higher than I estimated. Might need to gather more before the deep snow comes. Saw movement in the valley yesterday. 3 infected, moving together. They seem to be following the creek. Don't know if they're tracking something or just wandering. They didn't look up toward the cliff, didn't seem aware of anything above ground level. This supports my theory that they hunt primarily by sound and smell, maybe motion. If I stay quiet and hidden, they might never know I'm here. The hardest part is the not knowing. I don't know if there are other survivors. Don't know if this infection is everywhere or just regional. Don't know if someone somewhere is working on a cure, a solution, anything. The radio is useless. I crank it every few days, scan through frequencies, get nothing but static. I tell myself I made the right choice. Building this place, preparing. I'm alive, safe, fed. Better off than 99% of humanity probably is right now. But knowing you made the right choice doesn't make loneliness hurt less. Winter deepened, snow measured in feet now. Drifts against the north side of the cabin reaching halfway up the walls. I'd built the door to open inward for exactly this reason, so I wouldn't be trapped by accumulation. The shutters stayed closed most of the time, both for warmth and concealment. Leaving the cabin dim even at midday, I fell into rhythms. Wake at dawn, stoke the fire, eat a small breakfast. Morning chores, check supplies, maintain equipment, exercise in the limited space to keep muscles from atrophying. Midday meal, usually hot soup or stew, making the most of the warmth from cooking. Afternoons for reading, writing, thinking. Evening meal, then darkness and sleep. The infected didn't seem to like the deep cold. I saw fewer of them as winter progressed, and the ones I did see from a distance moved slower, less coordinated. I wondered if the infection struggled in low temperatures, if they were freezing to death out there. Hoped for it, even while knowing that spring would likely bring any survivors back to full function. December brought the shortest days, the longest nights. I burned through lamp oil and candles faster than I wanted, but the darkness was oppressive enough that I allowed myself the luxury of light. Read books I'd read before, finding comfort in familiar stories. Reread The Road and found it uncomfortably prophetic. Switched to Jack London and old westerns, stories where people survived through determination and skill. Christmas came and went unmarked except in my journal. Wrote about memories of holidays before, my nephew Quillen opening presents with the manic energy kids have, my sister Brenna's cooking, filling her house with smells that meant family and safety. All gone now, almost certainly. Phoenix was gone early. No way they survived. I cried that night, first time since this began. Let it out in heavy, shaking sobs that echoed in the cabin's emptiness. Grieved for the world and everyone in it, for the future we'd lost, for the isolation that stretched ahead with no end in sight. Then, I was done, wiped my face, added wood to the fire, and went back to surviving. January was brutal. Temperatures dropped to 20 below, and wind screamed through the mountains with a sound like dying things. I went outside only when absolutely necessary, to the spring for water, to the outdoor latrine I dug and covered with a small shelter. Even those brief exposures left me shaking, fingers numb despite heavy gloves. The cabin held heat well, but I was burning through firewood faster than anticipated. Did the math and realized I'd need to gather more before spring, which meant venturing into the deadfall areas while snow was still deep. Risky, but necessary. I chose a day when the wind died and the sun came out, temperature climbing all the way to 15 degrees. Strapped on snowshoes I'd made during construction, traditional ash and rawhide, old style, the kind that don't break or fail. Took a hatchet and rope, left the firearms. Too cold for them to function reliably anyway, and the noise wasn't worth the risk. The nearest deadfall area was a quarter-mile away, where a rockslide years ago had taken down a dozen big pines. The trees were dry and perfect for burning, and I'd been harvesting from the pile for 3 years. Enough left for many more. Moving through chest-deep snow, even with snowshoes, was exhausting. Every step required effort, and the cold seared my lungs with each breath. Took me 30 minutes to cover that quarter mile. By the time I reached the deadfall, sweat had soaked my inner layers despite the temperature. I worked fast, cutting branches to manageable lengths, bundling them with rope into loads I could drag. The hatchet bit into frozen wood with solid thunks that echoed too far for comfort, but there was no quiet way to do this. After an hour, I had 3 bundles ready, each weighing maybe 40 pounds. That's when I saw the tracks. Fresh, crossing through the snow about 50 yards from where I worked. Not animal tracks, human, or what used to be human. Barefoot, which made no sense in this cold, the prints showing individual toes splayed wide. The stride length suggested running, and the tracks led from downslope toward the ridge above my cabin. My cabin. I stood frozen, hatchet in hand, heart hammering. The tracks were maybe an hour old, the edges still sharp. No wind drift filling them, which meant something infected had passed very close to here very recently and had gone in the direction of my home. I left the firewood bundles and started back, moving as fast as snowshoes allowed, no longer caring about noise or caution. If something had found the cabin, if the location was compromised, all my preparations meant nothing. The approach angle from the deadfall area gave me a view of the cabin from above and to the side. I stopped at the ridgeline, breathing hard, scanning. No movement. The cabin sat undisturbed, smoke still rising thin from the chimney. The tracks I'd left going to the spring were undisturbed. Nothing suggested intrusion. But the other tracks, the infected tracks, had come this way. I followed them with my eyes, trying to trace their path through the terrain. They went along the ridge, staying high, passing within 200 yards of the cabin, but not descending toward it. Just passing through, on some route that made sense to whatever remained of the thing's mind. I watched for 20 minutes, searching for any sign of the creature, saw nothing. Eventually, the cold forced me to move, and I made my way back to the cabin, entering slowly, checking corners, making sure I was alone. I was. The cabin was exactly as I'd left it. But knowing something had been that close, that my perfect isolation had an expiration date, that changed the equation. I went back for the firewood the next day, armed this time, making 3 trips to haul it all back, stacked it under the tarp with the rest, calculating that I now had enough to make it to April, maybe May if I was frugal. The tracks haunted me. I went back to where I'd seen them, following their path. They led up and over the ridge, descending the far side toward the old highway miles away. One infected, traveling alone, moving through mountains in winter with no protection from the cold. The fact that it could do that suggested something about the infection's effect on the body. Pain receptors may be shut down. Temperature regulation altered. The body consuming itself for fuel, burning through fat and muscle to maintain function. How long could they keep going like that? Would they eventually starve, freeze, collapse? Or would the infection sustain them somehow, keep them mobile and dangerous until they found prey? Questions without answers. I went back to the cabin and reinforced the shutters, added another bar across the door, checked my ammunition supply for the 100th time. February brought a thaw, temperatures climbing into the 40s during the day, snow melting to slush. I knew from experience this wouldn't last. March would bring more storms. But the temporary reprieve felt like a gift. I opened the shutters, letting light flood the cabin for the first time in weeks. The brightness hurt my eyes, and I realized how adapted to dimness I'd become. I took inventory of supplies, making careful lists. The food situation was good. At current consumption rates, I had 18 months of staples remaining. The smoked elk was down to about 30 pounds, and I'd need to think about hunting again once the weather stabilized. Ammunition was plentiful. Medical supplies were adequate. Basic first aid, antibiotics I'd stockpiled, pain medication, suture kit. Water was infinite as long as the spring kept flowing. Firewood sufficient through winter's end. By any measure, I was surviving. Not just alive, but maintaining, even thriving in a way. The isolation was hard, but I'd adapted, found rhythms and routines, kept my mind occupied. But I missed people. Missed conversation that went somewhere, missed laughter, missed physical contact. The last person I'd touched was the clerk at the sporting goods store in Missoula, handing me change for ammunition. A brief, meaningless contact that I hadn't valued at the time. Would have given anything to shake someone's hand now. I started ranging farther during the thaw, scouting in widening circles from the cabin. Told myself I was gathering information, learning the patterns of infected movement, identifying resources. Really, I was just desperate for something different, some break in the monotonality. Found an abandoned hunting camp 3 miles southeast. Someone had left in a hurry, tent still standing, supplies scattered, a rifle lying in the dirt with the bolt missing. No bodies. Boot prints leading away down the mountain, and other prints, lots of them, following. I salvaged what I could, some canned food, a good knife, a tarp, 50 feet of climbing rope. Buried the rifle, useless without the bolt, but I couldn't bring myself to leave it. Felt too much like grave robbing as it was. Found signs of other camps, other people who'd tried to escape into the mountains. Most showed signs of violent ends. One had clearly burned, the inhabitants likely trying to stay warm, the fire spreading. The infected had probably been drawn to the light. I never found survivors. Part of me was relieved. The cabin couldn't support multiple people, and I'd built it as a sanctuary for one. Sharing would mean compromise, risk, the possibility of betrayal or conflict. Better to be alone. But that logic felt hollow, even as I told myself it made sense. March came with the predicted storms, dumping another 3 feet of snow and driving me back into hibernation mode. I'd gathered enough firewood during the thaw that fuel wasn't a concern, but the isolation pressed down again, heavier each time. I started having dreams, not nightmares exactly, though some were unpleasant. Dreams where the world hadn't ended, where I was back in Missoula or visiting Brenna in Phoenix, normal life continuing. I'd wake from these feeling worse than from the nightmares, the loss sharp and fresh all over again. One dream recurred. I was in the cabin, but it wasn't on a cliff. It was in a valley, surrounded by infected, thousands of them pressed against the walls, silent and patient. In the dream, I knew they'd wait forever, that I'd eventually have to come out, that they had nothing but time. I'd wake from this one, gasping, checking the shutters, listening for sounds outside. There were never any sounds except wind and snow. I marked the spring equinox in my journal, noting that I'd been alone for 5 months. Felt both shorter and longer than that. The days had blurred together, individual events standing out, but the time between them compressed into a gray sameness. The snow began melting in earnest in early April. I watched from the windows as patches of ground appeared, brown and dead-looking, but representing the possibility of warmth. Growth, renewal. The spring ran stronger with snowmelt, and I had to adjust the overflow channel to prevent flooding in the cave. The garden plot was a mess when I finally uncovered it, filled with debris and dead vegetation from last year's growth. I spent 3 days cleaning it out, turning the soil, mixing in compost from my waste pile. The physical work felt incredible after months of confinement, muscles burning, sun on my face, sweat that meant exertion rather than fear. I planted early crops, peas, lettuce, radishes, things that could handle cool weather. Had saved seeds from last year's plants, and I treated each one like treasure, placing them carefully, covering them with soil I'd enriched and prepared. The infected became more active with the warming weather. I saw them regularly now in the valleys below, moving along what used to be trails and roads, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups of 3 or 4. They seemed to follow patterns, routes that made sense to whatever drove them. I watched them through binoculars, trying to understand. They didn't shamble or moan like movie zombies, moved purposefully, efficiently, conserving energy. When they ran, it was fast and coordinated. When they stopped, they became absolutely still, heads cocked, listening or smelling or sensing in ways I couldn't understand. Their clothes were mostly gone, rotted away or torn off during whatever activities they engaged in. Naked bodies, pale and discolored, covered in sores and wounds that didn't seem to bother them. Some looked emaciated, others strangely swollen. The infection affected them differently. Or maybe they'd been infected at different stages of health. One afternoon, I watched a group of 5 corner and kill a deer in the valley below. The hunt was coordinated, professional almost, with some infected driving the deer while others waited in ambush. They brought it down quickly, and the feeding was frenzied but brief. Within minutes, they'd consumed most of the carcass and moved on, leaving only bones and hide. They could hunt, could plan, could work together. This wasn't mindless plague, and that made it so much worse. I increased my vigilance, started doing perimeter checks 3 times a day instead of 2, kept the rifle within arm's reach at all times, slept lighter, waking at every sound. The garden sprouted in late April, tiny green shoots pushing through the soil. I felt absurdly proud seeing them. These fragile signs of life in a dead world. Watered them carefully from the spring, pulled weeds, watched for any signs of distress. Also, started fishing. The creek in the gorge below was accessible via a climbing path I'd established during construction. Dangerous, exposed, but the protein source was worth it. I went down at dawn, spent a few hours with line and hook, usually caught 3 or 4 trout. Climbed back up with the fish in a bag, smoked them in the fireplace. The climbing worried me. One mistake, one loose rock or moment of inattention, and I'd fall 300 feet to my death. No rescue coming, no one to even know I'd died. But the alternative was staying in the cabin, and I couldn't do that anymore. Needed the movement, the risk, the evidence that I was still alive and capable. May brought real warmth. Temperatures in the 60s during the day. I left the shutters open, let the cabin air out. The smell of wood smoke and unwashed human had accumulated over winter, and fresh air helped. I even bathed in the spring, the water glacially cold, but worth it to feel clean. The garden thrived. Peas climbed poles I'd set up, lettuce formed heads, radishes swelled in the soil. I harvested and replanted in cycles, adding beans and squash and tomatoes as the weather warmed. The tomatoes were experimental, short season at this altitude, but I wanted to try. I also spent time improving defenses, extended the early warning system I'd built, simple tripwires attached to bells positioned around the approaches to the cabin. Not foolproof, but they'd alert me to anything large moving through the area. Also built a secondary escape route, a rope ladder I could deploy from the back window, dropping into a chimney in the cliff that I'd scouted during construction. If the cabin was overrun, I'd go down and out, into the gorge and away, hoping I'd never need it. June arrived, and with it, the first anniversary of the world ending. 6 months since I'd seen another living person, 6 months of isolation in a sanctuary that felt increasingly like a prison. I marked the day by opening a bottle of whiskey I'd saved, drinking enough to feel it, but not enough to impair judgment. Toasted the dead, toasted survival, toasted the loneliness that was both burden and companion. That night, I heard sounds outside. Not the wind, not animals, voices, human voices, speaking in the darkness beyond the cabin. I froze, whiskey glass halfway to my lips, listening. 2 voices, maybe 3. Conversation I couldn't make out through the walls. Speaking normally, not whispering, not trying to hide their presence. People. Survivors. Here. My mind raced. How had they found this place? What did they want? Were they actually alive? Or was this some trick of the infection? I set down the glass and picked up the Glock, moving to the shuttered window. Through the narrow gaps between boards, I could see light. Flashlights, moving along the approach trail. They were coming to the cabin. Every instinct screamed at me to stay hidden, stay quiet, let them pass. The cabin looked abandoned from outside. I'd made sure of that. No obvious signs of habitation. If I stayed dark and silent, they might investigate briefly and move on. But they were people, living people, the first I'd encountered in 6 months. I made a decision I'm still not sure was right. I called out, "Stop there, I'm armed and I will shoot." The voices stopped. The lights stopped moving. Silence stretched for 5 seconds, 10. Then a woman's voice, cautious but clear. "We're not infected. We're not here to hurt you. We saw your smoke yesterday, thought maybe someone was alive up here." "Stay where you are," I said, moving to the door but not opening it. "How many of you?" 3. Myself, my husband, and our friend. "You armed?" A pause. "Yes, we've had to be." "Put your weapons on the ground, step back from them. I'm going to come out, and if anyone moves wrong, I start shooting." Another pause, then, "Okay, we're putting them down." I waited, listening. Heard the clink of metal on stone. Took a breath, removed the bar from the door, opened it slowly. The flashlight beams hit me immediately, blinding. I raised the Glock. "Kill those lights or I'll kill you!" The beams dropped. My vision adjusted. 3 figures stood 20 feet from the cabin, hands raised, weapons indeed on the ground in front of them. 2 women, 1 man, all looking haggard and dirty, but very much alive. The woman who'd spoken was maybe 35, dark hair pulled back, wearing hiking clothes that had seen better days. The man was older, 50s, heavy beard, carrying himself like former military. The other woman was younger, early 20s, holding a baseball bat she'd apparently counted as a weapon. "My name is Therese," the first woman said. "This is my husband, Brecken, and our friend Oakley. We've been moving through the mountains for 3 weeks, avoiding the infected, looking for somewhere safe. We saw your smoke. We're not here to take anything from you. We just wanted to know there were other people still alive." I kept the Glock trained on them, not trusting, not yet. "Where did you come from?" "Coeur d'Alene, originally. It fell about 3 weeks after the initial outbreak. We've been running ever since." "How'd you survive this long?" Brecken answered, voice rough from disuse or smoke damage. "Moved at night. Avoided cities, towns, anywhere with population. Scavenged from abandoned places. Lost 3 people from our original group. His voice caught. Lost them to those things. I studied them, looking for signs of infection. The discoloration I'd seen on bodies, the clouded eyes, the wrong way of moving. Saw none of it. They looked exhausted, underfed, scared, human. Anyone bitten, scratched? Any contact with infected fluids? No, Therese said firmly. We've been careful. Tested clean 3 weeks ago when we had access to medical supplies. There was no test for this infection that I knew of, but I didn't contradict her. Why come up here? Mountains in June are still cold at night. Food is scarce. Terrain is dangerous. Exactly, she said. The infected don't seem to like the altitude. We've seen fewer the higher we climb. Thought maybe we could find somewhere defensible, wait things out. Wait for what? Nobody's coming to save us? We know, Oakley said quietly, speaking for the first time. We just want to survive another day. That's all any of us want. I lowered the gun slightly, though I didn't holster it. This cabin is mine. I built it. I stocked it. It's set up for 1 person, maybe 2 if we were close. Can't support 5. We're not asking to stay, Therese said quickly. We just wanted to see if you were alive, maybe trade information. We've covered a lot of ground, seen things, learned things about the infected that might be useful. That caught my attention despite my caution. What kind of things? Can we sit? We've been walking since dawn. I promise. We're not a threat. I considered. Every survival instinct said to send them away, maintain isolation, avoid the complications people brought. But 6 months alone had worn me down more than I'd admitted, and the hunger for information, for connection, for voices that weren't my own was overwhelming. Fine, I said, but weapons stay on the ground. You sit there, I sit here, we talk. Then you leave. They sat, and I did too, keeping distance and the gun ready. We talked through the night. They told me about Coeur d'Alene's fall, how the infection had swept through in less than 48 hours, about the attempted evacuations, the blocked highways, the military units that had tried to hold and been overrun. They'd escaped into the mountains with a group of 9, but encounters with infected and the harsh conditions had reduced them to 3. I told them what I'd observed, the patterns I'd noticed in infected behavior, the hunting coordination, the apparent intelligence, the way they seemed to avoid extreme cold but became more active in warmth. Brecken had a theory. Military background, he explained, worked in intelligence before retiring. What we're seeing doesn't match any biological agent I'm aware of. The coordination, the pack behavior, the apparent communication between infected, that suggests something affecting the brain in specific ways, not just destroying it. So what, they're still thinking? Oakley asked. Not thinking like we do, but maybe operating on instinct at a higher level than animals, like a hive mind, but distributed. Each individual retaining some capacity for problem solving, but acting in coordination with others nearby. That's terrifying, Therese said. Yes, Brecken agreed. It means they can adapt, learn, possibly even plan. I thought about the deer hunt I'd witnessed, the coordinated ambush. I've seen that. Watched a group take down prey using tactics, flanking, driving, cutting off escape routes. Exactly. Which means traditional zombie survival strategies don't work. Barricading and waiting them out won't help if they can figure out ways around or through barricades. We talked through strategies, shared observations, compared notes on survival techniques. They'd learned to mask their scent using pine sap and mud, making themselves harder to track. I'd learned that smoke dispersal was critical, that vertical columns drew attention, but dissipated smoke didn't. As dawn approached, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: community. These people weren't friends, weren't even really allies yet, but they were human, intelligent, trying to survive. Talking to them reminded me why survival mattered. You should go, I said, as the sky lightened. Before full day. The infected are more active in daylight up here. Therese nodded, standing slowly. Thank you for talking with us. For not shooting us. Where will you go? There's an old fire lookout tower about 10 miles north, and we're going to check it out, see if it's defensible, maybe set up there for a while. I almost told them it was a bad idea. The tower was exposed, visible for miles, and the wooden structure wouldn't stand up to a determined assault. But it wasn't my decision to make. Be careful, I said instead. And if you find something up there, something useful, come back and let me know. You want us to come back? Brecken asked, surprised. Maybe. If you've survived another week, proven you can handle yourselves, we could trade information. Supplies, maybe. It wasn't a friendship offer. Wasn't even really trust. But it was something other than total isolation, and I found I needed that. They left, retrieving their weapons and disappearing into the early morning mist. I watched them go, then secured the cabin and tried to sleep. Couldn't. My mind was racing, replaying conversations, analyzing everything they'd said, questioning whether I'd made the right choice. The next week I spent reinforcing everything. The cabin, the approaches, the escape routes. If people had found me once, others might. And not all survivors would be as reasonable as Therese and her group. The garden continued producing. I harvested peas and lettuce, planted more beans. The tomatoes were actually setting fruit, small and green but promising. I caught fish, smoked meat, maintained my stores. And I waited to see if they'd come back. They did, 8 days later. This time, I saw them coming from farther out, the early warning bells giving me time to prepare. I met them outside the cabin, armed but not pointing the gun at them. You survived, I said. Barely, Therese replied. She looked worse than before, a bandage around her left arm, exhaustion deep in her eyes. The tower was occupied. 20 infected, maybe more. They'd been using it as some kind of gathering point. Hive, Brecken said. That's what it looked like. They were just sitting there, packed in, not hunting or moving, just waiting. For what? Don't know. We didn't stick around to find out. Fought our way clear, but Oakley... Therese's voice broke. She didn't make it. I felt the loss despite not knowing the girl. 3 had become 2, and each death diminished us all. I'm sorry, I said, meaning it. We need help, Brecken said bluntly. We can't survive out here on our own. We're not asking for charity. We can work, contribute, help defend, but we need somewhere stable. Every instinct said no. The cabin was mine, built for one, and sharing meant risk and complication. But looking at them, seeing the desperation and determination, I thought about 6 more months of isolation. 6 months of talking to myself and ghosts. There's a cave system about a quarter mile from here, I heard myself say. Natural chambers, one of them large enough for a shelter. If you were willing to do the work, set it up properly, you could have your own space, close enough for mutual defense, far enough for privacy. Therese and Brecken exchanged glances. You'd let us settle that close? On conditions, I said. You contribute to shared defense. You bring your own supplies, don't drain mine. You follow my lead on security protocols. This area stays hidden. You don't tell anyone else about it, don't lead anyone here, and if you leave, you don't come back. Deal, Brecken said immediately. Don't answer so fast. Think about it. This is isolation, probably for years, maybe forever. No rescue coming, no return to normal life. Just survival in the mountains with infected roaming below and winter coming eventually. We've already lost normal life, Therese said. We're just looking for somewhere to stay alive. I led them to the cave system, showed them the main chamber I'd scouted during initial surveys of the area. It was dry with a narrow entrance that could be fortified and enough space for a small shelter. They'd need to build it themselves, would need supplies, but it was possible. They set up camp while I went fishing, needing space to process what I'd agreed to. The isolation I'd maintained so carefully was breaking, and I wasn't sure if that was survival instinct or loneliness overriding judgment. Caught 4 trout, brought them back, and found Brecken had started clearing the cave entrance while Therese inventoried their supplies. They had less than I'd feared: some canned goods, basic tools, a tarp, sleeping bags. They'd been traveling light, moving fast, prioritizing mobility over stockpiling. "You'll need more," I said, looking at their meager pile. "A lot more before winter." "We know," Therese said. "There's a small town about 15 miles from here. We passed it coming up. Looked abandoned, but might have supplies. Or might have infected. Towns are death traps. So's starvation." She had a point. I'd been living off stockpiles and supplementing with hunting and fishing, but they were starting from nearly nothing. "We scouted together," I said. "Tomorrow, early, in and out, fast. We take only what we can carry and only what's essential." They agreed, and I left them setting up a basic camp in the cave, returning to my cabin to second-guess everything. That night, I barely slept, listening for sounds, wondering if I'd made a fatal mistake. The town was called Riverton, one of those tiny mountain communities that existed mostly for summer tourism and logging. We approached at dawn, moving slowly, watching for any sign of movement. The place was dead, not abandoned, dead. Bodies in the streets, in cars, in doorways. Most had been there long enough to be partially decomposed or picked clean by scavengers. The smell was awful. We split up against my better judgment, Therese and Brecken taking the general store while I checked the hardware store. Found supplies, more than expected. Canned food, bottled water, tools, tarps, rope. I loaded a backpack with essentials, moved to the sporting goods section. That's when I heard the screaming. I ran toward the sound, found Therese and Brecken backed against the store's wall, 3 infected between them and the exit. The infected were fresh, recently turned from the looks of them, still wearing recognizable clothing. They moved with that terrible coordination, spreading out to cut off escape routes. I shot the first one through the head from 20 feet away. The second one turned toward me, and I shot it twice, center mass, and then head as it fell. The third got within 5 feet of Brecken before he brought a crowbar down on its skull. Then silence, broken only by our breathing. "We need to leave," I said. "Gunshots will draw more." We ran, carrying what we could, leaving behind supplies we couldn't manage. Made it to the edge of town before we saw them coming, dozens of infected, emerging from buildings and forest, drawn by the shots, moving toward us with purpose. We ran faster. The packs dragged at us, 40 pounds each of supplies and tools, but dropping them wasn't an option. I could hear them behind us, not making sounds, but their movement through brush, the slap of bare feet on pavement. The terrain saved us. We hit the slope leading up into the mountains, the grade steep enough that our climbing experience gave us an advantage. The infected followed, but without our knowledge of the route, without our desperation-fueled strength. We made it to the cabin by early afternoon, collapsing outside, gasping. Checked each other for bites, scratches, any contact. Found nothing. We'd been lucky, incredibly lucky. "That was stupid," I said when I could breathe again. "That was necessary," Brecken countered. "We got supplies, enough to help establish the cave shelter." He was right, but it didn't make me feel better about the risk. We'd drawn attention to the area, possibly led infected toward the mountain. I spent the rest of the day watching the approaches, waiting for pursuit that never came. Over the next 2 weeks, the cave shelter took shape. Brecken proved skilled at construction, and together we built a frame structure inside the main chamber. Walls of logs and stone, a roof of overlapped bark, and waterproof tarp. Not as solid as my cabin, but adequate for shelter. We also established routines. Morning perimeter checks, split between the 3 of us. Shared meals occasionally, usually me cooking something and bringing it to their camp. Information exchange in the evenings, sharing observations about infected movement, survival techniques, memories of the world before. Therese was a teacher before, high school science. She talked about her students, wondered which of them had survived, probably knew the answer but didn't say it. Brecken was more reticent, military past clearly still affecting him, but he opened up slowly. talked about deployments, about learning to survive in hostile territory, about how this was worse because the enemy didn't follow any rules he understood. I told them about building the cabin, about the years of preparation, about the family I'd lost contact with and now assumed dead. We mourned together, shared grief, found some comfort in not being alone with the loss. July brought heat to the valley below, but the altitude kept the cabin area comfortable. The garden exploded with growth. Tomatoes ripened, turning red and orange, tasting like summer and normalcy. I shared them with Therese and Brecken, teaching them about preserving, about planning for winter. We also improved defenses, extended the early warning system to cover the approaches to the cave, set up observation points on the ridges, places where we could watch the valleys without being seen, cached supplies in 3 locations, backup stores, in case the main camps were compromised. The infected continued moving through the valleys, but none came close to our altitude. We saw them daily through binoculars, sometimes large groups, sometimes individuals. Their patterns were becoming clearer. They moved in circuits, following what might have been migration routes or territorial boundaries. Every few days, large groups would converge on certain locations: the fire tower Therese had mentioned, a collapsed bridge 5 miles south, a cave system in the eastern valley. "Hives," Brecken insisted. "They're establishing central points, gathering, then dispersing. It's organized." "But why?" Therese asked. "What purpose does it serve?" We didn't have answers, just observations and theories and growing concern that the infection was more sophisticated than we'd thought. August arrived, and with it, a change. The infected started moving higher. Not many at first, just a few individuals spotted at elevations they'd previously avoided, then small groups, then larger ones. "They're adapting," Brecken said, watching through binoculars as a group of 7 navigated a steep slope with disturbing efficiency. Learning that higher ground isn't actually hostile, just different. "Or they're being driven," I suggested. "Something below is pushing them up." "What could push them? They're the apex predator now." "Other groups, competition for territory or food. We don't know what their social structure is if they're fighting among themselves." We increased watches, kept the camps locked down as much as possible. I went fishing less, worried about exposure on the climbing path, relied more on garden produce, and stored food. The first infected reached our elevation on August 12th. I was checking the early warning system when I heard bells, faint but unmistakable. Something had crossed the wire 200 yards north of the cabin. I signaled Therese and Brecken, 3 quick whistles, our code for potential threat. They emerged from the cave shelter armed, ready. We converged on a position that gave us a view of the approach: 1 infected, male, middle-aged from the look of him, naked and covered in scars and wounds. He moved erratically, stopping to sniff the air, then continuing. Not hunting us specifically, I thought. Just wandering. We watched him pass within 50 yards of the cabin. He paused, head cocking, seeming to sense something. My hand tightened on the rifle. If he found us, if he went back and somehow communicated the location. But he moved on, continuing up the slope, disappearing into the rocks above. We maintained watch for 2 hours, saw nothing else. He'd been alone, scouting, or just randomly exploring, but his presence at this altitude meant our safety margin had shrunk. "We need to be more careful," I said that evening. "No fires during the day, smoke only at night when it's harder to see. Minimize movement outside. They're coming closer." More infected appeared over the following weeks, never many at once, usually singles or pairs. We watched them, learned their patterns. Some seemed to be following game trails, possibly hunting the deer and elk that summered at this altitude. Others appeared to be searching, investigating every cave and crevice. One afternoon, 3 infected spent an hour examining the base of the cliff below my cabin. From the window I watched them, heart pounding, as they paced and sniffed and looked up. The overhang was severe enough that they couldn't see the cabin, but they knew something was up there. Could they smell us? Sense our presence somehow? Eventually they moved on, but the incident shook me. The cabin's location had been its primary defense. If that was compromised, if they could track us here, everything became vulnerable. We held a council that evening, the three of us discussing options. We could leave, Therese suggested. Head higher, above the tree line, where they might not follow. And go where? I asked. Winter above tree line is lethal. We'd need shelters we don't have, supplies we can't carry. We could fight, Brecken said. If a group came, we're armed. We have defensive positions. Fight how many? 3, 5. We might manage. 20? 50? We get overrun. So what? We just wait and hope they don't find us. I didn't have a better answer. We'd prepared as well as we could, but ultimately, survival depended on luck and the hope that the infected would lose interest in this area. September brought the first hints of fall. Aspen turning gold in the valleys, nights cooling toward frost. I harvested the last of the garden, pulling up plants, storing potatoes and carrots in the root cellar. The tomatoes had done better than I'd hoped, yielding maybe 20 pounds that I canned using jars I'd brought up years ago. Therese and Brecken helped with the harvest, learning the techniques, planning their own garden for next year if we survived that long. We worked in silence mostly, listening for bells, for sounds of approach, for anything that suggested threat. The infected activity decreased as temperatures dropped. They still moved through the area, but less frequently, and they seemed uncomfortable in the cold. I wondered if they'd migrate down to lower elevations for winter, if altitude would once again become our protection. On September 23rd, I heard a sound I hadn't heard in months, a helicopter, distant but unmistakable, the thump of rotors echoing through the mountains. We rushed to the observation point, all three of us staring at the sky. There, maybe 5 miles south, a Black Hawk helicopter flying low over the valleys. Military clearly, the markings visible even at distance. Should we signal? Therese asked, voice tight with hope. With what? Brecken countered. And what if they don't see us? What if the infected do? We watched it pass, heading north, disappearing over the ridgeline. No way to know if it was a rescue mission, a survey, a military unit still trying to establish order. No way to know if there were more, if this represented some larger organization that had survived. The hope hurt worse than the despair had. For months I'd accepted that civilization was gone, that survival was individual or small group, that no help was coming. Seeing that helicopter cracked that acceptance made me wonder if I'd given up too soon, if there were safe zones, organized resistance, some fragment of the old world still functioning. We didn't see another helicopter. Days passed, then weeks, and hope faded back into the background, replaced by the immediate concerns of survival. October arrived cold and wet, snow flurries mixing with rain. I began the winter preparation rituals, sealing gaps in the cabin, testing the fireplace, organizing firewood. Therese and Brecken did the same with their shelter, and I helped them insulate the walls with pine boughs and mud, creating a structure that might actually hold heat. The infected activity dropped to almost nothing. I saw one in the valley below on October 15th, and then nothing for 2 weeks. Either they'd migrated down, or the cold was affecting them more than I'd thought. We settled into winter routines. Shared meals became regular, cooking in my cabin since it had the better fireplace, eating together and talking through the long evenings. The loneliness I'd felt before had eased, and I realized how much I'd needed this. Needed people, needed voices and company, and the reminder that I was human. Therese taught me chess, using pieces we carved from wood. I was terrible at it, but the learning kept my mind sharp. Brecken shared military survival techniques, ways to preserve food I hadn't known, methods for staying alert during long watches. We became a team. Not exactly friends, the circumstances were too raw for that, but allies, people dependent on each other for survival and slowly building trust through shared experience. The first major snow came in early November, 2 feet overnight, and winter locked down hard. Temperatures dropped below zero, wind screaming through the mountains. We didn't venture far from the camps, staying close to heat and shelter. I'd been through mountain winters before, but never with so much at stake. Every decision mattered. Burn too much wood, run out before spring. Burn too little, freeze. Eat too much, deplete stores. Eat too little, weaken to the point where illness or injury became fatal. We managed, balanced the equations, stayed alive through skill and caution and luck. December brought the longest nights. I marked Christmas again, this time with Therese and Brecken, sharing a meal I'd prepared from hoarded supplies: canned ham, dried fruit reconstituted in water, bread I'd baked in the fireplace using the last of the flour. We didn't exchange gifts because there was nothing to give except survival, but we shared stories, memories of holidays before, families lost, traditions that no longer had meaning. "What do you think is happening down there?" Therese asked, gesturing toward the valleys, the world beyond our mountain sanctuary. "In the cities, the places that had millions of people. Are they all dead? All infected?" "Some of both," Brecken said. "The infection doesn't have a 100% conversion rate. We're proof of that. There are other survivors, pockets of resistance, people holed up in defensible locations." "For how long, though? Without infrastructure, without organization, how long can isolated groups last?" "Years, maybe. Decades if they're smart and lucky. Humans are adaptable. We'll survive in some form." "But not civilization," I said. "That's gone. We might live, but the world we knew, the society and technology and systems, all that's finished." We sat in silence, contemplating that reality. After a year, it shouldn't have been shocking anymore, but speaking it aloud made it heavier, more final. January passed in frozen stillness. February the same. I marked my journal entries by the day, kept track of time because losing that seemed like losing part of my humanity. Day 453, day 478, day 500. 500 days since the world ended. March brought the thaw, and with it, a problem I should have anticipated, but hadn't. Therese was pregnant. She told us on a morning when the sun finally had warmth in it, snow melting in patches, the promise of spring in the air. Brecken already knew. They'd been discussing it privately for weeks, but telling me made it real, made it something we all had to plan for. "How far along?" I asked, trying to process. 3 months, maybe 4. Hard to tell without medical equipment. "This is a problem." "We know," Brecken said. "We're not idiots, but it happened, and we're dealing with it." I didn't ask how it had happened. They were married, isolated, human. Of course it had happened. What I couldn't understand was how they could bring a child into this world, into this situation. But Therese was already showing early signs. The pregnancy was fact. We had to adapt. "You'll need more food," I said, thinking practically. "Better nutrition, protein, vitamins, and medical supplies. We don't have anything for childbirth." "There's a hospital in Libby," Brecken said, "about 30 miles from here. Might still have supplies." "Libby's a town, probably overrun." "Probably, but we don't have a choice." He was right. Without medical supplies, without someone who knew what they were doing, Therese and the baby would likely die during childbirth. We needed equipment, instructions, medications. We started planning the expedition, waited for better weather, for the snow to melt enough to make travel possible. Spent weeks preparing, mapping routes, identifying potential dangers, gathering every piece of equipment we might need. April arrived, and with it, the possibility of the journey. We set out on April 15th, leaving the camps locked and supplies hidden. If we didn't return, anyone finding the cabin would have no idea people had been living there. The journey to Libby took 3 days, moving carefully, avoiding obvious routes, watching constantly for infected. We saw them more frequently as we descended in altitude, groups of 5 or 10 moving along the old highway, hunting deer that were emerging from winter ranges. We gave them wide berth, moving through forest and along ridge lines, staying invisible. Libby had been a town of about 12,000. Now it was a graveyard. Bodies everywhere, buildings burned or collapsed. Cars abandoned in intersections. And the smell, even after a year and a half, the smell of death lingered. The hospital was on the north side of town, a 2-story building that had partially collapsed. We approached at dawn, watching for movement, seeing none. The interior was a nightmare. Bodies in hallways, in rooms, piled in what must have been a last-stand defense. Blood on every surface, signs of violence that made my stomach turn. But the pharmacy was intact. The infected had no use for medications, and looters had apparently avoided this place. We found antibiotics, painkillers, IV equipment, surgical supplies. Found obstetrics textbooks in the medical library. Found everything we'd hoped for, and more. We also found something else. In the basement, behind a barricaded door, we found survivors. 6 of them. Living in a storage room, surviving on hospital cafeteria supplies and water from a backed-up sink. They'd been there since the beginning, too afraid to leave, watching as the world died outside their shelter. They were in bad shape, malnourished, sick, traumatized. 3 adults, 3 children, the youngest maybe 5 years old. When we opened the door, they screamed, thought we were infected. Took minutes to convince them we were human. "Please," one of the adults begged, a woman named Sutton who'd been a nurse. "Please take us with you. We can't stay here anymore. The food's almost gone. The water is making us sick. We'll die if we don't leave." I looked at Brecken, saw the same conflict in his eyes. We couldn't support 6 more people. The cabin and cave shelter were already stretched thin with 3. Adding 6 more, including children, was impossible. But leaving them was a death sentence, and we all knew it. "We have a place," Therese said before I could argue. "It's not big, it's not comfortable, but it's safe. You'll have to work, contribute, follow rules. But you can come." I wanted to argue, to explain the math, the limited supplies, the increased risk. But looking at the children, seeing their hollow eyes and empty expressions, I couldn't. We took them with us. The journey back took 5 days instead of 3. The survivors, Sutton the nurse, a man named Cortland who'd been an accountant, a woman named Reverie who didn't speak, and the 3 children whose names I learned were Flint, Marlowe, and Timber, moved slowly, weakened by their ordeal. We had to carry the youngest child, Timber, who was too small and weak to walk the distances. The other children managed, tough in the way that children forced to survive become tough. We also had to avoid infected more carefully. 9 people made more noise, left more tracks, presented a larger heat signature. We moved in stages, hiding during the day, traveling at dawn and dusk when visibility was low. Made it back to the mountain on April 20th, exhausted, low on supplies, but alive. The next weeks were chaos. We had to expand the shelters, build additional structures, had to ration supplies even more carefully, had to establish new routines, new watches, new ways of living with 9 people instead of 3. Sutton proved invaluable, her medical knowledge giving us a chance with Therese's pregnancy. She examined Therese, declared her healthy, estimated delivery in late August or early September. Started preparing. Teaching us all basic obstetrics, explaining what we'd need, what could go wrong. Cortland was useless at first, too traumatized to function, but slowly he began helping with tasks, gathering firewood, maintaining the camp, basic labor. Reverie remained silent, but she worked hard, cooking, cleaning, watching the children. The children were the biggest challenge. They needed more food, more attention, more care than adults. They made noise, asked questions, struggled with the isolation and fear. But they also brought something we'd lost, hope. Watching them play, hearing them laugh, seeing them adapt, reminded us why survival mattered. I built a second cabin over the summer, Smaller than the first, just one room, but enough for Sutton and the children. Cortland and Reverie took over the cave shelter, while Therese and Brecken prepared for the baby in their original space. The garden expanded. Everyone contributed, digging and planting and tending. We nearly doubled the size, planting every seed we had, focusing on high-yield crops. The growing season cooperated, warm and wet, and by late July, we were harvesting more than enough to feed 9 people. Hunting became regular. Brecken and I would go out together, taking deer and elk, smoking, and preserving the meat. The children learned to help with processing, and while it was grim work, they adapted. We were becoming a community. Not by choice, but by necessity, 9 people dependent on each other, learning to work together, building something that might last. August arrived, and Therese went into labor on the 27th. I'll spare the details. It was long, difficult, terrifying. Sutton knew what she was doing, but we lacked equipment, pain medication, ways to handle complications. Therese screamed for hours. Brecken held her hand, looking helpless, while the rest of us waited outside, listening, praying to gods most of us had stopped believing in. The baby came just before midnight. A girl, small but healthy, crying with lungs that promised strength. Sutton cleaned her, wrapped her in cloth we'd boiled and prepared, handed her to Therese. Watching that moment, seeing Therese hold her daughter, seeing Brecken break down crying, seeing hope and love and future in that tiny face, that broke something in me. Made me realize how much I'd hardened, how much I'd focused on survival at the expense of living. They named her Laurel, after Therese's grandmother. She was the first child born in our community, the first new life in a world of death, and she represented something none of us could articulate, but all of us felt. We celebrated that night quietly, with a small fire, and shared food and stories about the world we'd lost and the one we were building. The children stayed up late, fascinated by the baby, asking endless questions. Even Reverie smiled, the first time I'd seen any expression on her face. September passed in the rhythm of new parenthood. Therese recovering, Laurel growing, all of us adapting to the sounds of an infant in camp. The crying, the feeding, the constant need for attention. It was exhausting and wonderful and terrifying. The infected became active again as weather cooled. We saw them more frequently, larger groups moving through the valleys. But they didn't come to our altitude, and we maintained vigilance, staying hidden, staying quiet. October arrived, and with it, a stranger. I was on perimeter watch when I saw him, a lone figure moving up the approach trail, not trying to hide, waving his arms like he wanted to be seen. Through binoculars, I could tell he was human, alive, unarmed as far as I could see. I signaled the others, and we took positions, ready for anything. As he got closer, I called out, "Stop there! Identify yourself!" He stopped, hands raised. "My name is Fintan. I'm alone, unarmed. I saw your smoke, took a chance you might be friendly." Another survivor, drawn by signs of habitation, should have been more careful about smoke, but with 9 people, keeping it completely hidden was impossible. "What do you want?" "Food, shelter, information. I've been traveling for 3 months and haven't seen another living person in weeks. I'm not a threat. Please." We brought him in, cautious, checking him for weapons and signs of infection. Found neither. He was in his 40s, thin, exhausted, carrying a pack with minimal supplies. Over the next days, he told his story. He'd been a forest ranger before, knew the mountains, had survived by moving constantly, never staying anywhere long enough to be found. He'd come from the west, working his way through Idaho and Montana, looking for other survivors, for any sign of organization or safety. "There's nothing," he said. "Cities are dead, towns are dead. Military tried to hold a few places, but they're gone too. It's just scattered survivors trying to stay alive one more day." "How many survivors have you seen?" "Maybe 30 over 3 months, some alone, some in groups. Most don't make it. The infected are learning to hunt us, getting better at it. He fit into the community easily, offering skills we needed. He knew wilderness survival, tracking, navigation. Knew plants and animals, what was edible, what was medicinal. Within weeks, he was indispensable. But his arrival also meant we were visible. If one person could find us, others could. And not all strangers would be friendly. I increased security, extended the early warning systems, established protocols for strangers, made it clear that the camps were defended and we would protect them. Winter came, our second in the mountains, and we were ready. 9 adults, 4 children, and 1 infant, all dependent on the supplies we'd gathered and the structures we'd built. It was tight, sometimes uncomfortable, but we managed. The infected disappeared again with the cold. I wondered if they migrated like animals, following some instinct to lower elevations and warmer temperatures. Or maybe the cold killed them, their bodies unable to maintain function below certain temperatures. We didn't know, and without the ability to research or communicate with other survivors, we'd probably never know. The winter was harsh, but we survived it. Huddled in our shelters, burning carefully rationed firewood, eating preserved food, and telling stories. The children grew, learned, adapted. Laurel turned 6 months old, healthy and strong. And I realized I was happy. Not the happiness of the old world, of comfort and security and certainty, but the happiness of purpose, of community, of knowing that what I did mattered to the people around me. We'd survived 2 years. Built something from nothing, kept ourselves and each other alive in a world designed to kill us. Spring came, and with it, hope. We planted a larger garden, built a greenhouse from salvaged materials, expanded the hunting territories. The children helped, learning skills they'd need to survive. We taught them everything: how to track, how to fish, how to identify edible plants, how to hide from infected, how to defend themselves if hiding failed. It was an education no child should need, but it was the world we lived in. On the anniversary of the outbreak, 3 years since the world ended, we held a ceremony. Simple, secular, just an acknowledgement of time past and losses endured. We spoke names of people we'd lost, told stories about them, cried together. Then, we looked forward, talked about plans for the summer, improvements to make, skills to learn. Talked about the future, not in grand terms, but in the immediate, practical ways that mattered. We'd survived, and we'd keep surviving, one day at a time, for as long as we could. The infected were still out there, in the valleys, in the forests, in the ruins of cities. The world was still dead, society still collapsed, civilization still ended. But here, on this mountain, in these crude shelters, we were alive. We were human. We were a community. And that was enough. I'm writing this now in my cabin, looking out through the narrow window at the valley below. It's June, year 3, and the world is green and alive despite everything. Therese and Brecken are with Laurel, teaching her to recognize her parents' faces. The other children are helping Sutton in the garden. Finton is checking the perimeter. Cortland is splitting firewood. Reverie is cooking something that smells incredible. This is my life now. Not the one I expected, not the one I would have chosen, but the one I have. I built this place to survive alone. Instead, I found people who needed it, who needed each other, who needed the sanctuary I'd created from paranoia and preparation. We don't know what tomorrow brings. Don't know if the infected will find us, if disease will strike, if conflict will tear us apart, if winter will be too harsh or summer too dry, or any of 1,000 other disasters that could end this. But today, we're here. We're alive. And I'm telling you this, whoever might find these words, because someone should know that humanity didn't end when civilization fell, that people still fought, still adapted, still found ways to live. We're not victims, we're survivors. And we'll keep surviving, hidden in these mountains, protecting each other, building something that might last. Because that's what humans do. We survive, we adapt, we endure. Even when the world ends, we find a way. This is Dalton Vess, signing off from a cliffside cabin nobody knows about, in mountains that became our sanctuary 3 years after everything ended. We're still here. And we're not giving up. Not ever. The months that followed Laurel's first birthday brought changes I hadn't anticipated. The infected adapted, and so did we. It started with Fintan noticing patterns in their movements. He'd been tracking them from observation points, mapping their routes, trying to understand their behavior. What he found disturbed all of us. They're establishing territories, he explained one evening, spreading out a crude map he'd drawn. This valley here, always the same group of about 20. This area, a different group, maybe 15. They're not wandering randomly anymore. They've divided the region into zones. Like wolf packs? Cortland asked. Exactly like wolf packs. Each group has defined boundaries and they defend them. I watched 2 groups meet at a boundary last week. They didn't fight, just acknowledged each other and turned back. That requires organization, Sutton said. Memory, recognition of other individuals. How is that possible if the infection destroys higher brain function? Maybe it doesn't destroy it, I suggested. Maybe it rewires it. Keeps certain capabilities while eliminating others. They can't talk, can't use tools, can't plan in abstract ways. But they can coordinate, remember locations, recognize each other. It was a chilling thought. We'd been thinking of them as mindless monsters, but the reality was more complex. They were damaged humans operating on instinct and basic cognition, but that was more dangerous than mindless aggression. We adjusted our strategies accordingly, started mapping the territories ourselves, learning which areas were claimed by which groups, avoided boundary zones where multiple groups might converge, planned hunting and gathering trips to minimize exposure. The children grew older, and their education evolved. Flint, the oldest at 12 now, started accompanying hunts, learning to shoot with the 822 rifle. Marlowe, 10, proved talented at tracking and observation. Timber, 8, had a gift for identifying plants and their uses. They were becoming capable, these children of the apocalypse. Tougher than kids should be, but that was survival. Therese had started teaching them reading and basic math, using books I'd brought up years ago. It seemed almost absurd, teaching algebra when the world had ended. But she insisted. They need to think, she said. Need to solve problems, understand concepts, use their minds for more than just survival. Otherwise, we're no better than the infected. She had a point. Humanity wasn't just about staying alive. It was about remaining human, keeping the parts of civilization that mattered. Knowledge, education, culture, hope. We'd settled into something like a normal community. People had roles, responsibilities, relationships. Sutton and Cortland had developed a partnership. Not romantic, but practical, supporting each other. Reverie remained quiet, but had become essential. Her cooking and preservation skills keeping us fed through lean times. Fintan rotated through tasks, his versatility making him valuable everywhere. And Therese and Brecken were raising Laurel with a fierce dedication, determined that their daughter would know safety and love despite the horror outside. I found myself acting as leader by default. Not because I wanted the role, but because the cabin was mine, the location was mine, the knowledge of this area was mine. People looked to me for decisions, and I accepted the responsibility. It wasn't always easy. Resources were always tight, and I had to make calls about rationing, about risk, about who did what. Had to mediate disputes, enforce rules, maintain security. Leadership was exhausting, but it also gave me purpose. The isolation I'd built this place to achieve had transformed into community, and I discovered I preferred the latter. July of year 3 brought a crisis that tested everything we'd built. Timber came down with fever, high enough to cause delirium. Sutton examined her, couldn't identify the cause. It wasn't the infection. We knew those signs, the discoloration and aggression that marked the turning. This was something else. Could be bacterial, Sutton said, worry clear in her voice. Appendicitis, maybe, or infection from something we didn't notice. Could be viral. Without diagnostic equipment, I'm guessing. We treated with antibiotics from our stockpile, medications we'd salvaged from Libby. Sutton monitored Timber constantly, tracking symptoms, adjusting treatment. The rest of us waited, helpless, watching a child suffer. Timber got worse before she got better. 3 days of high fever, vomiting, weakness that left her barely conscious. We prepared for the worst, talked about burial, about grief, about the possibility of loss. Then, the fever broke. Timber woke, weak but lucid, asking for water and food. Sutton cried with relief, and we all felt the weight lift. The incident reminded us how fragile we were. One serious illness, one injury beyond our ability to treat, and we could lose someone. Medical supplies were finite. Sutton's knowledge was extensive, but not infinite. We were operating at the edge of capability. "We need more medical supplies," Sutton said after Timber recovered. "Better antibiotics, diagnostic tools, surgical equipment. What we have won't last forever, and we've already used a significant portion." "Where would we even find that?" Cortland asked. "Bigger cities, Bozeman maybe, or Missoula. Medical centers, research facilities, pharmacies. The risk is higher, but so is the potential reward." I didn't want to authorize it. Cities were death traps, crawling with infected, structurally unstable, filled with hazards. But Sutton was right. We needed supplies, and small-town hospitals wouldn't have what we required. "We'll plan it," I said. "Scout routes, identify targets, prepare. But we don't go until fall, when infected activity decreases. And we go heavy. Multiple people, heavy weapons, prepared for the worst." We spent the rest of summer preparing. Trained with weapons, practiced tactical movement, studied maps and satellite images I'd saved years ago. Created contingency plans, escape routes, rendezvous points if we got separated. It felt like preparing for war, which I suppose it was. August passed into September, and we watched the infected patterns change with the cooling weather. They moved less frequently, seemed sluggish in the morning cold. Their territories remained consistent, but within those territories, activity decreased. We set the mission for mid-September. Brecken, Fintan, and I would go, leaving Therese, Sutton, Cortland, and Reverie to protect the camp and children. We'd head to Missoula, about 80 miles away, target the medical center and pharmacy school, and extract whatever we could carry. Expected duration, 1 week. 2 if things went wrong. We left on September 15th, carrying heavy packs and weapons, moving down out of the mountains into the valleys we'd avoided for months. The descent revealed how much the world had changed. Forests we'd known were overgrown, trails disappeared under vegetation, buildings we passed were collapsing, reclaimed by nature with shocking speed. 3 years was enough for wilderness to reassert itself, to erase human presence from the landscape. We saw infected from a distance, gave them wide berth, moved mostly at night, using night vision equipment I'd salvaged. The darkness was safer. Infected seeming less coordinated without light. Took us 4 days to reach Missoula. The city was a corpse. Buildings burned or collapsed, streets impassable with debris, but it was still massive, sprawling, offering countless hiding places for both supplies and threats. We approached the medical center just before dawn on day 5. The building was partially collapsed. One wing completely destroyed, but the main structure stood. We entered through a ground floor window, weapons ready. The interior was a maze of darkness and death. Bodies everywhere. Some infected, killed, some dead from other causes. Starvation, suicide, desperation. The smell was overwhelming even after 3 years. But the pharmacy was intact, locked, but a crowbar took care of that. Inside, shelves of medications, some expired, some still good. We filled packs with antibiotics, painkillers, surgical supplies, IV equipment, found insulin, anti-inflammatory drugs, antiviral medications, everything Sutton had requested, and more. The pharmacy school was 3 blocks away, attached to the university campus. We moved carefully, watching for infected, seeing signs of them everywhere. Bodies, waste, territorial markings that looked disturbingly deliberate. Reached the school without incident, found the medical supply room. Jackpot. Diagnostic equipment, surgical tools, reference textbooks, training mannequins we could use for practice. Too much to carry, we had to choose, taking what was most essential. We were loading the second pack when we heard them. Voices. Not human voices, not exactly, but vocalizations. The infected communicating, if that's what it was. Coming closer, multiple sources surrounding the building. Out! Now! Brecken led, I followed. Finton brought up the rear. We exited through a back door into an alley and saw them, 20 at least, maybe more, moving toward us with terrible purpose. They'd found us, trapped us, and were closing in with coordinated precision. We ran. No choice. Fighting that many was suicide. Ran through alleys, over debris, through burned buildings. Behind us, they followed, not making sounds now, just pursuing with that relentless efficiency. Fintan went down first. Tripped over rubble, twisted ankle, couldn't keep pace. Brecken went back for him, and I provided cover fire, dropping 3 infected, but more kept coming. We made it to a building, barricaded the door, climbed to the 2nd floor. Below, the infected gathered, testing the door, examining walls, looking for entry points. We were trapped. Supplies, but no escape. Weapons, but limited ammunition. Time, but no good options. The roof, Finton said, pointing up. We get to the roof, cross to another building, maybe lose them in the urban maze. It was desperate, but everything was desperate now. We climbed, Finton limping, but managing. Reached the roof as the door below gave way, infected pouring into the building. The adjacent building was 10 feet away, gap over a 3-story drop. Doable with a running start, fatal if we missed. Brecken went first, made it, turned to catch the packs we threw. I went next, landing hard, rolling. Fintan hesitated, ankle clearly painful, doubt on his face. You can make it, I called. Run and jump, we'll catch you. He ran, jumped, didn't make it. Caught the ledge with his hands, packs dragging him down. Brecken and I grabbed him, pulled, muscles screaming. Behind him, infected poured onto the roof, seeing us, coming fast. We got him up barely and ran again. Across rooftops, down fire escapes, through a parking structure. The infected followed but lost ground, their climbing ability limited. By noon we'd escaped, holed up in a basement 3 blocks from the medical center. Fintan's ankle was badly sprained, maybe fractured. We'd lost 1 pack but kept the other, still carrying valuable supplies. We need to get back, Brecken said. This city is too hot. Too many infected, too organized. I agreed. We'd gotten what we came for, more or less. Pushing our luck further was stupid. The journey back took 8 days. Fintan's injuries slowed us, and we had to avoid the infected groups that seemed to be searching for us, following our trail. Twice, we barely escaped encounters, and I used more ammunition than I wanted, knowing each shot diminished our long-term security. But we made it. Arrived at the camp on September 28th, exhausted, injured, but alive and carrying supplies that would significantly improve our medical capabilities. Sutton went through the supplies with reverence, organizing medications, reading reference texts, planning for contingencies we'd been unable to address before. This changes things, she said. We can handle infections now, manage chronic conditions, deal with injuries that would have been fatal. We're still vulnerable, but much less than we were. The mission had been worth it. Barely. But I knew we couldn't repeat it often. Each trip to a city risked everything, and our luck would eventually run out. We settled back into routines as October arrived. The children were excited to see us return, had been worried, had learned something about loss and relief. Laurel was walking now, stumbling around camp on uncertain legs. bringing joy to everyone. Winter came, our third in the mountains, and we were ready. More supplies, more people, more experience. The cold locked us down again, but we'd learned to make the space comfortable, to find ways to stay occupied during the long darkness. I started writing more, documenting everything in detail. The journal had become less a record of events and more a comprehensive guide: how we survived, what we learned, mistakes we made, successes we achieved. If something happened to us, if others found this place, I wanted them to have the knowledge we'd accumulated. Therese was teaching the children more advanced subjects now. History, using books and memory. Science, practical applications relevant to survival. Literature, reading classics I'd brought up, discussing themes and ideas. It was education in miniature, civilization in microcosm, and it mattered. These children would be the future, if there was a future. What they learned, what they became, would determine whether humanity survived with any of its former character or degraded into something else. Spring of year 4 brought changes. Reverie started speaking, slowly at first, then more frequently. She'd been silent for so long, we'd assumed she'd lost the ability. But apparently, she just needed time, safety, trust. Her story emerged in fragments. She'd been a musician before, pianist, had lost her family in the initial outbreak. The trauma had shut her down, made her retreat into silence as a defense. But surrounded by community, by people who cared, she'd healed enough to emerge. She started teaching the children music, using a harmonica someone had salvaged. Simple melodies at first, then more complex pieces. The sound of music in the mountains was strange and wonderful, a reminder of beauty in a world of horror. We also started ranging farther in exploration, not to cities, but to nearby areas we hadn't fully scouted. Found other abandoned camps, other signs of survivors who hadn't made it. Salvaged what we could, learned from their mistakes. One expedition found something unexpected, a radio, military grade, still functional. Solar-powered, designed for field use, in a cache that suggested some military unit had been through the area. Fintan got it working, scanned frequencies. Most were dead, static, silence. But on one frequency, we found something. A broadcast, faint, distant, but clear. A voice reading numbers, coordinates, times. A code we didn't understand, but that suggested organization, structure, people working together toward some goal. Could be military, Brecken said, or government remnant. Someone with equipment, training, purpose. Or could be a trap, I countered. Automated broadcast drawing people in. We listened for days, trying to decode the pattern. The coordinates seemed to reference locations in the Northwest, Washington, Oregon, Idaho. The times were scheduled, suggesting regular broadcasts. Whatever it was deliberate. We should investigate, Fintan suggested. At least try to make contact, see if it's legitimate. And risk everything we've built? Lead them here if they're hostile? Or connect with others if they're friendly? Dalton, we've been isolated for 4 years. Maybe there's something larger happening. Something we could be part of. I resisted, protective of our sanctuary, suspicious of anything that threatened our security. But the others wanted to try, wanted to believe that humanity was organizing, fighting back, building something beyond just survival. We compromised. We'd attempt contact via radio, using codes and anonymous references. If they responded positively, we'd consider more. If anything seemed wrong, we'd shut it down. Brecken handled the communication, his military background giving him knowledge of protocols. He sent a simple message. Survivors in northwest Montana, seeking information. Can you confirm? We waited. Days passed. No response. Then, on the 5th day. Confirmed. Northwest Montana coordinates recognized. What is your status? Brecken responded, Group of 13, fortified location. Stable resources, seeking information on larger organization. Another wait. Then, organization exists, multiple settlement groups across region, coordinating security, resource sharing, communication network. Interested in connecting? It was everything we'd hoped for and feared, proof that others survived, that organization existed, that we weren't alone. But also unknown risks, obligations, the possibility of betrayal or exploitation. We discussed for hours. Therese was in favor, seeing potential for Laurel and the other children to grow up in something larger than our small camp. Sutton agreed. Medical knowledge could be shared, improved. Cortland was cautious, but open. Reverie trusted the group's judgment. I remained skeptical, but I was outvoted, and democracy mattered even in survival situations. We provided more information, vague coordinates of our region, details about our capabilities. They responded with an invitation to send representatives to a gathering scheduled for late June, coordinates in central Idaho. It could be a massacre, I said. Everyone gathering in one place, perfect target. Or it could be the beginning of rebuilding, Therese countered. Don't let fear keep us from possibilities. We prepared. Selected representatives, Brecken and Fintan, would go, both capable and experienced. Prepared supplies, weapons, communication equipment. Set protocols for contact, for rescue if needed, for what to do if they didn't return. They left on June 1st, carrying the radio, moving toward coordinates that might represent hope or might represent death. While they were gone, the rest of us maintained the camp, tended the garden, watched for threats. The children asked endless questions about where Brecken and Fintan had gone, what they were doing. We tried to explain in ways they could understand, looking for other people, trying to build something bigger. 2 weeks passed, 3. No contact, and I began assuming the worst. Then, on day 21, the radio crackled. Brecken's voice, exhausted but excited. It's real. It's actually real. There are settlements, hundreds of survivors, organized resistance. They're building something, Dalton. They're rebuilding. Relief and fear fought in my chest. Infections? Threats? Screened. Everyone's clean. Security is tight. Protocols are solid. It's not perfect, but it's civilization, or the start of one. You need to see this. Over the following days, Brecken transmitted details. 7 major settlement groups, dozens of smaller ones. Maybe 2,000 survivors total across Washington, Idaho, Montana. Coordinated by a council of representatives, each settlement maintaining autonomy but sharing resources and information. They'd cleared areas of infected, established safe zones, begun agriculture and infrastructure repair, had plans for long-term sustainability, for growth, for rebuilding. It was incredible and almost impossible to believe. Brecken and Fintan returned on July 3rd, carrying supplies from the other settlements, seeds, tools, medical equipment, books, evidence that the network was real, functional, growing. They want to incorporate our camp, Brecken explained. Add us to the network, share resources, provide mutual defense. We'd maintain independence but have support, connection, trade. And what do they want in return, I asked. Information about this area. Help establishing routes through the mountains. Contribution to shared defense if needed. It's cooperation, not exploitation. We discussed, debated, argued. Some saw opportunity, others saw risk. The children were excited about the possibility of meeting other kids, of having more than just our small group. I struggled with it. This place had been mine, sanctuary built from paranoia and preparation. Opening it up, connecting to something larger, felt like losing control. But I looked around at what we'd built, not just the structures, but the community, the relationships, the life we'd created together. That was worth more than isolation, more than individual control. We connect, I said finally. Carefully, maintaining security protocols, keeping our location protected. But we join the network. Try to be part of something larger. The decision made, we began integrating. Radio communication became regular, sharing information about infected movements, weather, resources. Trade routes were established, with runners moving between settlements carrying goods and information. Other survivors visited, always small groups, always screened, always respectful of our security. We visited other settlements, saw how they'd organized, learned from their successes and failures. The children met other children, formed friendships, learned they weren't the only young people left in the world. Laurel had playmates, other toddlers stumbling around under watchful eyes. It was transformation, the isolation giving way to connection. Not the old world, that was gone and wouldn't return, but something new. Something built from survival and determination and the refusal to give up. The settlements faced challenges, infected continued to pose threats, weather and disease caused setbacks, conflicts arose over resources and decisions. But there was structure, organization, hope. Year 5 arrived, and our camp was unrecognizable from the solitary cabin I'd built. Multiple structures, a thriving garden, connections to a network of survivors. 13 people had become part of something much larger. I still maintained the cabin as my space, still valued solitude and independence. But I'd learned that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about remaining human, maintaining connections, building something worth preserving. The infected were still out there, territories and packs in constant threat. The world was still harsh, unforgiving, dangerous. We'd lost the old civilization and would never get it back. But we were building a new one, different, smaller, harder, but ours, built from nothing, sustained by will and cooperation and refusal to surrender. I'm writing this in year 5, looking out at a camp that bustles with activity, at children playing, at people working together. The journal that started as a record of isolation has become a chronicle of community. We survived the apocalypse, endured the isolation, found each other and built something worth protecting. And we'll keep building, keep surviving, keep hoping, because that's what humans do. We endure, we adapt, we persist. The world ended, but we didn't. And as long as we're here, as long as we're fighting, there's a future. This is Dalton Vess, no longer alone in a cliffside cabin, but part of a community in mountains that became our refuge. 5 years after everything ended, we're still here, still fighting, still human, and we're not done yet. Not by a long shot.